Welcome to the Veteran Spouse Network podcast, brought to you in collaboration with Coming Home Well. I'm your host, Hannah O'Brien, both a veteran spouse and the program manager for the Veteran Spouse Network. On each episode of our show, I will host different guests to learn more about the stories, unmet needs, and resources available to our military and veteran families. We're the show that's making space for your stories, so that here you know you're never alone.
Welcome back to the Veteran Spouse Network podcast. This month, I am so excited to be joined by one of our incredible peer leaders, Gretchen Davis. Gretchen has been a leader with us since 2019 and has been leading our weekly coffee chat, amongst many other groups, since April 2020. In addition to being a peer leader and a veteran spouse, Gretchen is also a licensed marriage and family therapy associate who works with the military and veteran family community. On this month's episode, we're talking about relationship health. We can all relate to this topic. Relationships are hard, and every relationship is unique because every single one of us is unique. And in our military and veteran relationships, we often face unique challenges, whether that be due to stressors of military family life or what can come after military service has ended. I'm excited to have Gretchen here today to share about some of these common challenges military and veteran couples face, both sharing from her own relationship as well as sharing tips and strategies she recommends to her clients to help them increase their relationship health and satisfaction. Gretchen, I'd love to turn it over to you to tell our listeners a little more about you, both as a spouse and the work that you do with your couples and your clients.
Thank you, Hannah. I'm really happy to be here talking with you today. Clearly, this is a topic that's near and dear to me. So for a little bit of background, I grew up in a military family. My dad served in the Air Force for 23 years. And all of my brothers, basically all the men in my family, serve in some capacity. So I met and married my husband before he joined the military. So we were married for 3 years prior. We've been married for 27 years at this point. He joined the Army when we had a preschooler and a newborn. And that was kind of my introduction to military life, having him go to the field and being home with the kids without much support. He served for 13 years, including 3 deployments to combat zones, multiple absences for training, and all sorts of fun stuff like that, and multiple PCS moves, including one to Europe, which I traveled with the kids, just me. So I feel like that gives me a good understanding of the active duty military perspective. And then he was medically discharged after 13 years of service due to injuries and obviously service-connected challenges. I think it's the best way to put that. So after he was medically discharged, I decided to return to school and pursue a career as a marriage and family therapist because I wanted to help other families in the military and veteran community navigate some of these challenges and to help build some more resilient relationships.
And yeah, I was going to ask you, because it's been really cool. I mean, you guys heard in my intro that, we've known Gretchen in this capacity since 2019. So I've gotten to see you kind of make that decision to go back to school, go through school, graduate school, start this career. Obviously you've been doing the work with VSN, serving these spouses and couples and for a long time, and now getting to it professionally. So I just wanted to say if there's anything else you wanted to add just about, your passion for the work and how it's been now that you're actually getting to be in that professional setting with these individuals.
So I couldn't be happier with my choice. I think, and I tell people all the time, my measure of that is if I won the lottery tomorrow, I would keep doing the work that I'm doing today.
Yes.
And I find it so rewarding to work with my veteran couples. I haven't worked with many active duty at this point, but it really helps me to connect with them on a level that I think a therapist without that military background may not be able to connect in that same way. I feel like that cultural competency really shows up in the room I also work with law enforcement and first responders as well, and see a lot of overlap. And it actually makes me appreciate things like Veteran Spouse Network and even, all of the nonprofit organizations that support the military and veteran communities, because I don't see the same type of support for those career fields.
Yeah. Yeah. And as someone whose husband is now in the first responder community, I honestly sometimes forget that I am a spouse of that, because you're right, there's not really someone trying to target you as a family member, and that so I think there's
a lot of overlap and a lot of unique challenges that people face in both, and it's actually not uncommon to find veterans in those community serving fields. So
oh yeah, which I think makes a nice segue after transition for a lot of veterans, at least mine.
yes.
So through VSN, through your work, through your life, you interact with a lot of veteran spouses and couples. So we're talking about relationship health, but I think maybe since this is the first time we've really talked specifically on this topic on the podcast, the best thing to do is kind of ask you, what are some of those common challenges you hear kind of coming up again and again for spouses and couples?
Yeah. So one of I guess a few of the challenges that come up that veteran couples face are emotional dysregulation. And that shows up actually frequently on both sides of the relationship, because we react to each other, right? We don't exist in a vacuum. And compassion fatigue, spouses who are doing anything and everything they can to help their veteran, and maybe to their own detriment, where they're not using the time to take care of themselves or getting even their own medical care, and mental health care takes a backseat to the veteran. That one's pretty common. Rigid thinking, so very black and white, military, everything has a standard operating procedure, right? And that's just not true in family life. There's not really a standard operating procedure for anything unless you sit down and write one. And I have yet to see that happen. So, so that very black and white thinking, there's only one right way to do something. Or if I don't like a behavior, that means I don't like you, it can be really frustrating, because it's really hard to negotiate that when you're a person who doesn't typically stay in that black and white, right? That can function in the flexible space in between.
Well, those are some good ones. And I mean, we serve the same community, but yes, also we hear that so much. I face that myself in my own relationship, most of those. So I want to jump to, you talked about kind of burnout, compassion fatigue, and kind of, what I hear a lot, right, is that line can get blurred when you're kind of taking on that caregiver role. So what could couples look out for when they're kind of either falling into that blurred line, or where it's starting to get, where they're taking a backseat in the relationship?
So a lot of times, excuse me, compassion fatigue looks like finding yourself feeling more frustrated, tired, a sense that your needs don't matter or that they're unimportant. It can look like feeling tired or overextended because you're not taking the time. And I know it's so cliche, but you're not taking the time to fill your cup. And one of the challenges here is that we create an environment in which everyone expects us as the spouse or the mom to handle everything. Any emergency, any crisis, it falls to you, even if it's not yours to carry. And so one of the best things you can do in terms of compassion fatigue is establish some boundaries for yourself around providing space for your own mental health, what you are and are not willing or able to do, conversations that you are or are not willing or able to have. I think those are some of the pieces that I speak to frequently in my capacity as a peer leader with Veteran Spouse Network, but also in the therapy room.
Yeah, yes. I know, at least from our perspective, right? That's a topic we hit.
Mm-hmm.
And it's I think talking about boundaries is huge because it's pretty critical, but certainly one of the harder things to do. So I don't know, what recommendations, tips, tricks do you have for whether that's like figuring out like the boundaries you need to set, or probably most importantly, how to hold those boundaries, especially if maybe you have folks in your life who that's new for them and they might not be respecting that.
Yes. One of the most common reactions to setting a new boundary is pushback. So it is important to know and understand, expect pushback when you make a change. But I think the first thing to remember when it comes to boundaries is that boundaries are for you. They're not for the other people. And so the first person who has to respect your boundaries is you. So if you say, I'm a person who does yoga on Mondays at this time, then you protect that space. You're the person who gets to say yes or no to doing something for someone else in that time, right? So if you say, I'm sorry, I can't take you for that appointment, or I can't drop everything and run to the store for you right now because I have my yoga class, remembering that you're important. And, obviously there's going to be times where something will come up, right? If there's an emergency, that's a different story. But if you find that there's emergencies every day or every week and you're missing out on your self-care, you have to kind of put your foot down, which is hard. And so I find that it's easiest if you come up when you set your boundary, anticipate the pushback, and come up with a simple phrase for yourself that's easy to remember to use whenever you need. So an example of one that I used, and it was a boundary that I had to set a long time ago. Unfortunately, I haven't had to use it in probably about 8 years, which is amazing, was I'm not going to engage with you when you're drinking because it wasn't productive. And I can't control, or I couldn't control my husband's drinking. I still can't control it, but right, the only person I'm in control of is me. And so for me to set that boundary and say, I'm not going to engage with you if you're drinking, was me protecting my well-being without trying to control my husband. And, it's those short, simple phrases, right? No is a complete sentence, no explanation necessary. And you don't owe anyone an explanation, right? But coming up with that short, simple phrase for yourself in advance can be so powerful in terms of being able to hold your line because you've already rehearsed it. You've already anticipated that pushback. And a lot of times the pushback will look like maybe guilt, some emotional manipulation. Oh, you don't love me, or, comments like, I guess I guess I don't matter. No, they matter too, but so do you.
No, yeah, I like that. I think sometimes when you're lucky, you create that phrase without realizing it, but that intentionality of that is really huge because yeah, it's something perhaps you can use with the person, but I like what you're saying that mostly it's that phrase for you to remind yourself and that you don't have to boom, it's automatic.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah,
No,
it's
I love
really
that.
helpful.
So, okay. So setting boundaries can really help with, especially if you're feeling that compassion fatigue or you may be stepping too much into the caregiver role. I've definitely seen, and I'm sure you have too, that like some spouses who really have become that caregiver, they actually find it quite difficult to let some of that go. And I think especially, right,
Yeah.
when maybe you realized you've become the caregiver and you've lost your spouse role and trying to get that back, or your spouse is becoming more independent and hopefully getting, healthier, and there's space for you to kind of step back. But sometimes, right, we see that actually becomes really difficult for the spouse, and they might like try and hold on to some of those things even longer than they need to, or even longer than is better for them. So in those cases, kind of what have you seen, and what if any advice do you have for people who that's where they need to go, but they're having a
They're
hard time?
struggling.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think first and foremost, it's important to remember that you shouldn't do something for someone else that they're capable of doing. Um, and I think it's also important to remember that doing, right, being capable, doing things no matter how big or small, helps someone to feel important and necessary. So it helps them to not feel like a burden. And so remembering that letting go the reins a little bit on some of those things and giving over the control of, a really common one would be medications or setting appointments. If your veteran is capable of setting his own appointments, letting him do that gives him a sense of agency. And that's actually really good for his mental health. Because a lot of times I hear about the spouses that are, or the veterans that are feeling incapable or feeling like a burden, right? That there are so many things that they can't do, and that their spouse, their wife, or their girlfriend needs to pick up all of those things. And we as women tend to want to caregive, which is amazing. We're hardwired to nurture.
Until it hurts.
Until it hurts, yes. And sometimes to our own detriment. And so letting go of those little things, right? Part of it is giving yourself that reminder, hey, he needs to be able to do for himself, but also reframing it a little bit more for yourself to the perspective of, if I let this go, what else can I use that energy for? So does that give you time that you could pick up a new hobby, right? Does it give you more time that you could read a book? I don't know if you've ever sat on the phone with the VA, but like you could get a lot of reading done. It's remembering that your veteran is a capable human being. They may need some accommodation. An example that I use frequently in terms of accommodation is my husband. He has a back injury that makes it painful for him to bend. So initially I got really mad because he would leave dishes in the sink. And I didn't know that it was because it hurt him to bend to put things into the bottom rack of the dishwasher. Once he told me, cool, I can work with that. Now I understand it hurts you to do that. So I'm not going to ask you to do that. But rinse your plate and leave it in the sink. But rinse your cup and put it in the dishwasher. The other accommodation that we use is with the dryer doing laundry. He can't, sometimes it's too painful for him to get clothes out of the dryer. I'll get the clothes out of the dryer and carry the basket to somewhere in the house so we can either fold the laundry together or he can fold laundry himself. And so those are reasonable accommodations. So instead of saying, oh, he can't do dishes or he can't do laundry, saying he can do those things with this minor adjustment. And that relieves pressure on me and gives him that sense of agency.
And I imagine even if he couldn't, then it's okay, well, what am I doing that you could possibly take on? Because you have
Exactly.
just that
Exactly.
that give and take.
Mm-hmm. And so it's figuring out, what does this look like for us? Because every family is going to have a unique situation. And that's why I use the very specific example of my husband, because that's one that I'm very familiar with, right? But I've also worked with clients where it looks like giving up or asking your veteran to make his own appointments or to pay bills online, right? Things that can be done with, if they're physically not able to do things that are a little bit easier to do on your own, or sitting down on a computer or on your phone. This may be more administrative task.
And if you think about how many tasks, whatever, how much there is in a relationship, those things can be found out, like what and negotiated in terms of who can kind of take on what based on, and any given day we have our own limitations.
Exactly.
And so,
Exactly. And it's honoring those too. We set a rule in my house a very long time ago that when you're having a bad day or when you don't feel well, we ask that you share that with the other people in the house so that they can take care of you and or make accommodation. And that was something that was hard for me to let go of, to say, oh, I have a headache and I need to take medication and I'm going to lay down for a half hour while that kicks in. And being able to acknowledge, one, that it's going to be better for me to go lay down for 30 minutes. And two, asking my husband, hey, can you keep an eye on the kids? Or can you make dinner? Or can you just keep the volume in the household down? Turning those responsibilities over to him was kind of hard for me in the beginning and something I still have to be pretty conscientious about, but it makes all the difference in the world.
yeah, certainly for you and honestly probably for everybody in the family, like not trying to guess why you're in a bad mood or,
Exactly.
reacting.
Exactly. But it's also, because the rule applied to the kids as well. So it's acknowledging that kids can have a bad day too, and giving them the grace and the space to share what they're going through and what their needs are so that we as parents can meet those needs and give them that respect and understanding.
And I'm glad you bring up kids because like so much of this stuff to you, relationship health and it extends to your relationships with your kids. And even if not, I mean it does, but like the modeling everything. So like
Yes.
setting these behaviors is good for you and your spouse, but also really important for your children. All right. So let's see what else we talked about or what other challenges you brought up. That rigid thinking. I that one comes up a lot. I definitely feel that in my own relationship. That was something having met, for listeners who don't know, I met my husband after his military service. So I have no idea what he was like pre-service or during service. And there, really quickly I gained that there are very strong belief systems and values. I know for him and I, the biggest one we don't always see eye to eye on is like respect. Which sounds like a weird thing to say, like how could we feel so differently about respect? But
But
that probably,
respect looks different in the military than it does in the civilian world.
yes, it does. And it comes up probably weekly in the household. And it's still something I struggle with trying to, understand and therefore like come at, receive, and react differently than I would have previously, just knowing where it's coming from. But again, I would have no way of knowing that if I hadn't like been involved in this community and been able to hear, oh, this is something that's unique to that. That's why it exists. That's where it's coming from. That's why it's the go-to. So I'd love to hear more just because that's when we still work on today about how you kind of see that play out and what couples can do to address that when it is creating conflict.
Yeah, so that concept of respect, we have to remember every service member, whether they were enlisted or an officer, doesn't matter which branch of service they were in. There is a very strict hierarchy and a very structured pattern of interaction. So if you're the lowly private, you're standing at attention for someone with more rank than you, waiting to be told that you could, that you can be at ease. And so just understanding, even at the very basics, another thing that they view as respect is wearing the proper uniform and having it properly adorned. When my husband first joined the Army, that was polishing your boots, which they don't have to do anymore, right? And pressing uniforms. And that was important. There's proper decorum and there's proper rules and expectations about the way that we interact with people. And where I find that the respect aspect comes up most frequently is when there's maybe a moment of like heightened tension. Maybe it's, I don't know, something isn't going right. And you see them snap into that, like, as I explained to a couple people, right? They put on that NCO hat where anything that you say that isn't affirmative to what they're doing, if you're questioning them, if you're anything except you're right, or, in cases with some children, yes, sir, or yes, ma'am, is viewed as disrespect. Where in a typical interaction with a friend or someone who's not affiliated with the military, it's perfectly acceptable to say, for me to say, oh, you know what, Hannah, I don't quite agree with that. Or can you help me understand more? Or maybe if we tried it this way, it might work better. You're not, in that world, you don't question.
No, normal, normal back and forth.
And so remembering, one, that this is something that's ingrained in them at basic training, whatever their basic training looked like. If, boot camp, basic training, every service calls it something a little different, but part of what they do in the first weeks in that training is instill that sense of respect and discipline. And unfortunately, the military doesn't have like a deprogramming system for, when they leave service. So granting them a little bit of grace and space for that, talking about it in that moment is not usually effective. Typically that turns into a conflict that's just not necessary. So what I recommend and what I do myself is I wait until kind of the dust has settled. Both of us are emotionally regulated. And sometimes that takes longer than others. And then I address it using what John Gottman refers to as the softened startup. I feel when I need. I feel maybe unheard when you are, and you don't want to win you, which is a hard one. So I feel unheard when my opinions aren't even considered. I need you to listen to me sometimes. And so, it's basic assertive communication. I feel when I need, but starting up with I feel is disarming, whereas you never listen to me is going to make them defensive and kick off a whole new conflict. And, so words like always and never are typically not the best in conversation, because if I say you never do this, my husband will come up with the exception for when he does. Yeah. And it's like, okay, but that was like 5 years ago. And I'm talking about right now. So coming into it just from a place of sharing your feelings, and that requires a little bit of vulnerability, which can be hard for people. And sometimes it's okay to say, I don't know what I need. I feel overwhelmed when there's loud yelling and I need quiet, or I need peaceful communication. That's from what I've found the best way to address those situations, not bringing it up in the moment, because typically emotions are already a little bit heightened. When you see that NCO hat go on, at least in my house, I can see a change in posture,
tone of voice. Right? Yeah.
Yep. Voice and everything, where I'm dealing with Sergeant Davis right now, and Sergeant Davis doesn't listen to anyone.
No. No, I definitely said that. Yeah, that guy doesn't necessarily have a wife, or definitely is in a position to communicate. I think that has been the biggest lesson over the last several years through trial and error. I've learned is I'm not, because I'm a very, my own personal thing is like I hate feeling misunderstood.
Yes.
In a conversation, because I'm just like, no, you're not, no, like you're not hearing me, you're not getting it. That's not where I'm coming from.
Yes.
And so it's so easy early in our relationship, early years into our relationship, I was just doing that. It was feeding the flames, which were feeding my flames, and so on and so on. And just realized, oh no, he can't hear me. He can't hear, he doesn't hear me. That's the issue. And he's not in a position to right now.
Yeah, he's not in that mental space in those moments. Yeah.
But yeah, so striking, once the dust is settled, are in school. Yeah. But that skill is helpful, because I tend to I'll be lighthearted or joke about it, and sometimes I realize I'll give an example that I think is very neutral, of like that I think is safe, that he could understand, like, yes, that was an overreaction. That person was not disrespecting you. And I have even learned through that sometimes I'm picking the wrong example. And then we start to go back into it because he's like, no, I need you to understand that is disrespectful. And here's why. And I'm like, oh
Mhm.
no, I thought this was
Yeah.
the low-hanging fruit to talk through. So that skill that you just talked about is one I've heard before, but you really do have to get in the habit of using it.
Yes, it makes a really big difference. And I'll say that I didn't do that until I went to school and started learning more about relationship health. And it's not that we didn't have a good relationship before, but we have a better relationship now. My husband is my unwilling guinea pig whenever I come across something that I want to try or something that is successful according to research. I want to see what it looks like in practice.
Yeah, real life.
Right. So I didn't go to my husband and say, hey, I'm going to start responding to you in this way. I just started trying it. So instead of when I could feel things getting heightened, could feel that like rigid thinking coming into play, I would take a step back, regulate myself, and work through that moment, and then come back later and say, I felt this when, and this is what I need from you. And what I found is that when I started doing that, he was hearing me more. And it started to change the way that we interacted across the board. And so we've been married for 27 years at this point. And I just started doing this like 3 years ago. And I can say that it's made a marked change in our interactions.
Well, I love to hear that. And I mean, that's the best way to do that. And especially if any of you listening are in similar roles to me and Gretchen, that's things you have to watch out for too, is not getting to be a clinical with your partner.
Yes.
But like, exactly like you said unwilling guinea pig, and people might hear that and be like, what do you mean? But what you just laid out is nope, that's just me learning something just like any of you learned this listening, and I'm going to
Mhm.
practice this. I'm going to see what does this get in
Yeah.
response.
Well, it's important to remember that the only person that you can control in the relationship is yourself.
Hmm.
And so when I do those things, I view it more as like an experiment for me.
Yeah.
If I change my behavior in this way, what will happen? And, you know, I've seen it make such a marked difference with the softened startup, but also with other areas of our relationship as well.
And that's, in theory is such an easy skill. So like just being able to be intentional about it,
Mhm. Mhm.
trying it out, being consistent and seeing how you feel, seeing how the reaction that you get.
Yeah, intention is everything. And I find that when you decide to be intentional about something specific and you focus on it until it becomes like a pattern of behavior for you, if it's something that works out and is successful in your relationship, it really makes a big difference in the long run.
Mhm. And that's really, I mean, that's true of anything in any relationship, right? Like having to have that intentionality awareness to
Yeah.
feed each other. You've spoken some to it, but you said it early on, and we've talked about it recently, which I think is a good one to finish up on is emotional regulation, because it is something, right, we hear a lot.
Yes.
And it is in in a relationship, there's always two parties, but
Mhm.
that's, I think we focus a lot too on, the veterans' ability to emotionally regulate.
Yeah.
But I think what's been really important too that you've kind of talked through just in your own examples is our own ability
Yes.
to emotionally regulate, and how those things then fit together if they don't and
Yes.
often aren't the same. So I just wanted to see if there was anything else you wanted to speak to on that.
So as I just stated, right, the only person that you're in control of in the relationship is you. And so you get to decide how much power you're going to give someone else over you. And part of that is starting to recognize in your body when you feel, and John Gottman refers to it as feeling flooded. So when you're emotionally flooded, and there's to some degree feeling a little bit heightened, feeling that emotion and acknowledging your emotion is good and it's healthy and there's nothing wrong with our feelings. But when you get so escalated, when you're so emotionally flooded that you're no longer hearing what the other person is saying, you're not going to get anywhere. So one of the things that I walk through with the couples that I work with, and something we've also even talked about in my coffee chat a few times, is recognizing when you're starting to feel flooded. Do you get a feeling in the pit of your stomach? Do you feel your hands clench or your muscles tighten? Does your heart start to race? Are you starting to have very rigid thinking? Do you feel yourself like digging in for the long haul or getting, postured for the fight? When you recognize that in yourself, that's where those boundaries come into play, right? I'm feeling emotionally flooded. I need to step away from this. Can we come back to it in 20 minutes? Taking a step away and engaging in some form of self-care so that you de-escalate yourself a little bit, preferably enough that your logic and reason come back online. Consider the other person's perspective for a minute and then re-engage. And in therapy, oftentimes we refer to this as like taking a negotiated timeout in a conflict. And one of the important things to remember about the negotiated timeout is that I may de-escalate faster than my husband. And so the rules that I always set with my clients are, if I'm the one who calls the timeout, it's my responsibility to bring us back to the conversation. So if I need 20 minutes and I take 20 minutes and I come back to my husband and try to re-engage the conversation, if he is not de-escalated yet, he says, I'm not ready. I'm still flooded. And then the ball is in his court to set a time frame to come back together and have that conversation. And emotional dysregulation is really common. Honestly, it's really common in most adults. But I've found, because according to Gottman's research, on average, it takes people 20 minutes to calm down or to de-escalate themselves. But I've found frequently within the veteran community, sometimes it takes a lot longer than that. I know in my house, we had times where we had to wait a day or two because something was so emotionally charged that it just took that much longer to de-escalate. And it's also okay to re-engage and step back again and say, whoa, nope, I'm escalating again, because you're not going to get anywhere if you're feeling emotional.
You're more likely to become more flooded. And I guess I'm only speaking for personal experience, but like the longer you wait to have that negotiated break, the longer it's going to take to regulate again, because it got more and more and more intense.
Yeah, because you kick yourselves up more and more. And sometimes another common pattern, because what we've kind of talked about so far, is people who, like couples that both escalate, right? Because you become flooded and the other person becomes flooded. And those are where yelling can happen, right? Where everybody's rising to the occasion. But another common pattern of interaction is for one person to pursue the disagreement and the other person to withdraw or shut down. And that just makes the person who wants to engage or resolve this problem in this minute become even more escalated. And the person who's shutting down needs space to process and emotionally regulate themselves so that they're ready and able to have that conversation too. So in both cases, there's emotional flooding. It's just a different reaction. Some people fight and some people fly. Some people freeze, or they feel the need to leave a situation.
And I think you've done an excellent job describing it, but to bring it back to the super basics, I think it's important to say there's a difference between the withdrawing and saying, I'm done with this, and what you're talking about with the negotiation, that intentionality to take the break and come back is not anywhere near the same thing.
No, it's not. And actually, so John Gottman refers to that, like shutting down and never engaging the conversation again, as stonewalling, right? And that's one of the four horsemen. And the four horsemen are just four different behaviors in conflict that the Gottman Institute has identified as detrimental to relationships. Now, fortunately, they also identified antidotes to the four horsemen. And for stonewalling, the antidote is actually physiological or psychological self-soothing. So that's taking that step back. It's breathing, it's engaging in meditation or something, any activity to calm yourself down. But the important piece that comes after that is the intentional re-engaging in the conversation and in some cases repair.
So I'm thinking about this in the terms of one member of the couple is listening and interested in all of these things, and the other one not so much, whether that's for whatever reason, not interested, not in a place to be able to have that level of self-awareness, what have you. So I imagine, and I can speak from my own personal experience of like over time learning, at least from the outsider perspective, of when I believe my husband is flooded, when he was not in a place to have that awareness himself or communicate that or ask for a break, but knowing we're going to get to a bad place. So I'm curious about that in a way where you're not trying to like make decisions for your spouse, but also being aware of when they might be getting to that point where it's still a good idea to take that negotiated break.
Yeah. And sometimes, so that can look a couple of different ways. One, as a spouse, we typically recognize our partner's emotions, or, when things are going to get heated, especially if you've been in a relationship for a couple of years, you have a typical pattern of interaction and you know what things are triggers. And so there's a few options. One, you can take the fall. You can say, oh, I'm feeling flooded. I need a break. I need a timeout. And that's okay. Sometimes that's the path of least resistance because that's just saying, oh, I'm the problem. And honestly, I'll say that was the approach that I took in the beginning with my husband, was just saying, oh, it's on me. And I would disengage based on my feeling. And so what I would verbalize, and it wasn't quite to that formal, I feel when I need, but it was, I'm feeling scared. I'm not feeling emotionally safe right now to continue the conversation. And so it wasn't saying, I feel like you're being a jerk. It was, this is what I'm feeling. Like it's intimidating sometimes especially when that NCO hat goes on. And so I would share what I was feeling and disengage, or, state my boundary and step away. And later I got to a place where I was able to say, you seem upset. Should we talk about this later? No, initially that was, it typically escalated things a little bit. And then when we would come back later and have a conversation about it, my husband got to a place where he would take ownership of that. And then we got to a place where I would say, wow, that was a really big reaction. And he would say, I overreacted to that. I'm like, oh, that's interesting. So it's figuring out in your relationship, what stage of your relationship are you at? Where are you in terms of having these conversations? If you have a partner who hasn't even acknowledged that maybe they're having some problems with emotional regulation, or that maybe their mental health has been impacted by their military service in some way. I've talked to so many spouses whose husbands don't acknowledge a PTSD diagnosis, or they haven't even sought mental health care, but show a lot of symptoms. And in those situations, I've found that the best thing to do is to take that on yourself, recognizing when you need to take a break and when you need to step away, and setting that boundary for yourself and saying, okay, if he starts yelling, I'm going to disengage. And That can look like, I don't feel like this conversation is productive right now because I'm feeling upset. Let's come back to this later. Because if you call them out on it, if you say, wow, you're yelling and you're being mean, then that can kind of blow up in your face and make things get a little harder instead of easier. But what I found once I started de-escalating things with my husband, and I've seen this work with clients too, but it's easiest to speak to my own experience in this space and in this capacity. What I found is when I took the onus of responsibility for diffusing the situation and then re-engaging the conversation when things were a little calmer, is that through my modeling the behavior and following up with those conversations that my husband became more and more self-aware. And that self-awareness was hard won in the beginning, but it led to him seeking mental health care for himself. It led to him taking responsibility and being more self-aware in those disagreements or in those heated moments, to a place where I can't say, like, there's no such thing as a perfect relationship. No marriage is easy. It's not sunshine and roses. There's going to be conflict because conflict exists in relationships, but we don't get to those escalated places anymore because we've learned how to fight.
And you're right. Like that really is the goal. It's not that you don't fight. That's not that conflict doesn't arise, because then we're probably holding a lot of stuff in reality. But yeah, how to do it in a way that feels safe and productive. And
one of the most important things is the repair after the conflict, because conflict is going to happen. And the repair after, depending on who steps in, it's taking responsibility for your part. Like, wow, I was really upset and I said some really mean things, and I'm sorry. The 5 love languages, of course, is pretty popular. There's even a military edition of the book. But on their website with the 5 love languages quiz, there's also an apologies quiz. And I will admit to being skeptical about it when I first saw the apologies quiz, because I was like, how many different ways are there to say I'm sorry, right? But I took the quiz and I had my husband take the quiz. And I was like, how do they know exactly what I need to hear as an apology? So that's a tool that I strongly recommend, and I suggest to couples in the therapy room too, is learning how to apologize to your partner. And you're not apologizing for the whole situation. You're not apologizing for someone else's feelings. You're apologizing for your behavior, because that's the thing that you're in control of. So one of the most basic things with an apology is there's never a but. I'm sorry I yelled at you. Not I'm sorry I yelled at you, but you did this wrong.
Yeah.
Right. It's I'm sorry I yelled because that's what you did. That was your part of the escalation. And to me, I find that makes a really big difference.
It's a huge difference. I have learned that in my own relationship, because a lot of times when there was the but, like even if it existed in my mind, like I yelled because you yelled, or like I snapped because you were being mean or something like that, or you being unfair, then I would get very stubborn and be like, well, I'm not going to apologize for what I did in reaction. But I have noticed as soon as I was like, well, I didn't need to snap, or I didn't need to say something mean in return, and being able to apologize for that and letting that be it. 90% of the time, the apology that you wanted is returned.
Yes.
My experience. And then it's modeled, and then it becomes, it just becomes that norm. Like sometimes there's things that in the moment I was like super, did not like your tone of voice, or sometimes again that military or whatever, he can be very like patronizing in the tone of voice. And so sometimes I will be like, you don't need to talk to me like I'm a baby, like, and I'll get mad. I'm a grown adult woman who is smart, capable, sort of thing. And then he might snap back, and I've realized if I can just apologize for my reaction, then, he's like, well, you were right, and I shouldn't have spoken to you like that in the first place. And I'm like, there we go. We're all good. Like, we both can move forward.
It makes all the difference in the world.
It really does. And I think the couple of things that have really stood out to me, especially thinking about, some of our participants and some of your clients who are in that situation where right now it probably feels like I have the partner who is not super self-aware or is not super or is reluctant to have these types of conversations, seek care, not even aware of maybe what they're dealing with and what's really affecting the relationship is what stands out to me mostly that you said is remember you can only control yourself in that relationship. I mean that that one is huge. But also like as you've been talking through some of these skills and talking about kind of where you've been more recently in a relationship versus, you know, what you may have tried decades ago, is also I think remembering that every relationship is different. And so just because maybe something doesn't work the first time doesn't mean it won't ever work.
Yeah. Oh, I had to be very persistent
Yeah.
with drawing when I started drawing attention to, or when I set the rule of letting the family know if you're having a bad day. And to get my husband to ease him into doing that, I would sometimes ask him, you know, I'd say, like, you seem a little prickly. Are you having a bad day? And so in the beginning, I would get, I'm not having a bad day. And I'm like, oh, could have fooled me.
Affirmed that you are, but okay.
And then it got to a place where, because I would ask that and because I would model that behavior, because I would say, oh, I have a headache or I had a really stressful day at work. Can you hold down the fort while I take 20 minutes for myself? My husband gradually started doing that himself. He gradually started to become more self-aware, you know, where he would say, after he would maybe overreact to something, or he would say, I'm having a bad day. I'm like, nobody's surprised.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for,
We're so
for acknowledging that. And then it got to a place where he would start to overreact to something. And then he would say, I'm having a bad day, and like disrupt it himself. And then we got to a place where he would say, I'm having a bad day, before anything escalated, whatever happened. And so it took persistence on my part with that. But that was a boundary, that was a rule that I really wanted to set, and an expectation that I really wanted to set, because I was tired of walking on eggshells. And I mean, to this day, and we started doing that in 2014, so 10 years ago, my husband will tell me I'm having a bad day and advanced skill, and this is what I need. So, and I need space, or, you know, can you get me a drink, or can you rub my back or rub my head, or whatever it is that he needs. But he's able now to not only acknowledge that he's having a bad day and have that self-awareness, but to ask for what he needs in addition. And that in and of itself made a really big difference for us.
huge. And there are a million, you know, variations of that where you can use that same tool. And like we had a very similar one where my question was, hey, are you feeling okay? You know,
Mm-hmm.
and I no, you're not, because I'm asking that question because I can tell that you're not feeling okay. A lot of times you'd be like, yeah, I'm fine, you know, right? And then later, as we, you know, got further along, we tried to develop code words.
Yeah.
I said I'm very stubborn, so like a lot of times I'll fight about, not anymore, but would fight about nothing. Like it wasn't anything that was like a critical to our relationship health. It usually might be about rules to a game or, you know, kind of really arbitrary things. And so for me, I was like, you know, when that's happening, I want you to say, this is a nothing fight. This is a nothing fight. And then his was the emotion of the flooding. And so I was like, what what would you like me to say if I notice that happens? And he said something his dad would always tell him when he was younger was to slow down, like slow down. So he was like, stay slow down. And I remember the first time I did it, and just to your point, I don't need to slow down. But then I remembered we went off, we took our break, we came back together, and I mentioned that because I was like, here's the skill that we built. You know, we developed a skill together, you know, these code words together, and this is how you responded. And he didn't even remember saying it.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Yeah.
Because how flooded he was. And so I think that's been helpful too, is like when we do set something up, being able to talk about how it did or didn't work. You know, and again, that's not something we were doing early on in the relationship, but
yeah. Well, it's important to remember that because all relationships are different, anything you try is an experiment. And that's how I always approach it. right, in my own relationship and how I encourage my clients to approach those changes. It's an experiment. Let's see what works. If this doesn't work, or maybe it works a little bit, so then we tweak it, because what works for me may work for you. It may be helpful, but maybe the words are different. Maybe it just doesn't work for you, and there's something completely different that works in your house, in your relationship. It's important to remember that not just military service, but your life with your family of origin, how you grew up, plays a really big role in what your relationships look like now. And so those are kind of two compounding factors. If you grew up in a household where maybe there was more yelling and less conversation, you may not know how to engage in a fight without yelling.
Yeah. Or see that that's, happening at all. Like
Mhm.
that's,
Mhm.
yeah.
Because it just feels normal. That's what you've seen, and that just feels like how things go. And so remembering that you're bringing your own background into the relationship, and your partner is bringing their background into the relationship, and that background for them often in this environment includes a veteran, and all of the things that come with that, whether it's just the rigid thinking from that's kind of instilled in basic training, and that respect and hierarchy and order, or little silly things that there's a certain way to do absolutely everything.
Yep.
That's all coming into the relationship too. And so remembering that it's going to take a little bit of time and a little bit of work. One person can get the ball rolling on change in a relationship. And once it builds momentum, that can spur the other person into action too, in terms of making change. And one person, essentially, you can change the interactions within your relationship system just by changing what you're doing.
So many good things. I feel like a lot of good skills, tips, strategies, advice has been given, but I always love to end just asking my guests if there's any kind of lingering, piece of advice or wisdom they'd like to leave our listeners with.
Honestly, the thing that I leave all of my clients with is asking them, if it's an individual session, what are you going to do to take care of yourself this week? How can you make yourself a priority? And it doesn't have to be big. It can be what I call micro self-care, taking 2 minutes to enjoy a cup of tea, or doing a guided meditation, or just breathing. So whatever it looks like for you, taking those few moments to take care of yourself. And couple sessions, I always ask, how are each of you going to take care of yourself this week? And what's one thing that you can do to connect? And again, it doesn't have to be an elaborate date night or anything crazy like that. It can be making the conscious decision to put down your phones and sit down and have a conversation for 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Not about your relationship, not about the kids or responsibilities, but a conversation like you would have had when you were dating and getting to know each other, because you're not the same people that you were when you first met.
You should always be trying to get to know those new versions of yourself.
Exactly.
Great advice and a great place to leave our listeners thinking about that. Because again, it takes back to that, if nothing else, what can you do for yourself? Any relationship. Day starts and ends with you.
Yes, it does. And if you aren't taking care of yourself, then you're not going to be your best self in your relationship.
Of course, right? Simple concept, but we often overlook it.
Yes.
Well, Gretchen, this has been lovely. This is probably the most conversational podcast I've had, which I love, and which makes sense. We know each other well, and it's such a great topic. I very much imagine we'll have other opportunities on the podcast to dive into the multitude of other things that go on in a relationship and how folks can maybe address that or work through them. But I think this has been really great to just hear some of these ones that we know show up a lot.
Yeah. Well, in the future, I'm always willing and excited to come in and talk about relationships and relationship health and all of the myriad of topics.
Yeah. It all, I mean, relationships are woven into everything we talk about at VSN, just because, that's often what we share is we are in a relationship with a service member or veteran more often than not. So And if anyone was like, oh my gosh, Gretchen, I just gotta get more of you. Friday afternoons, y'all, every Friday she's leading our coffee chat. So just hop in, chat, build some community.
We have a great group of ladies. We always look forward to having new people join us as well.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Gretchen. And thank you guys for listening. And we'll talk with you next month.
Oh, thank you. Bye.
Thanks again for joining us on the Veteran Spouse Network podcast, brought to you in collaboration with Coming Home Well. We thank you for listening today and hope today's session left you feeling a little more connected or gave you some insight into the experiences of our military and veteran families. Don't forget to check us out at veteranspousenetwork.org to learn more about how our military and veteran families can receive the support they deserve.